Hansel and Gretel. In a faraway kingdom, with seemingly endless forests and valleys, a woodcutter lived at the edge of the forest with his 2 children. Life was hard for the family, for times were hard. The woodcutter was a hard-working man, but business was bad. The 2 children, twins, a boy and a girl, with the names Hansel and Gretel. They both knew the seriousness of life. Their mother died while giving birth to their children. That happened 8 years ago. Her grave was not far away, on a hill near the house. He mourned for a long time, until one day he discovered a woman on the banks of a river in the forest. She washed herself in the clear water and sang a bewitching song that instantly enchanted him. After a few weeks, the woodcutter took her as his wife. The new stepmother was very strict. She knew a lot about herbs and forest plants and often spent hours on the road. This was just fine with the children, for she was scary to them and they preferred to stay away from her. Every evening, the stepmother mixed herbs into a tea for their father and rubbed an ointment on his aging back. This had been going on for weeks now. One evening, when business was particularly bad again, the woman rubbed the woodcutter's back with her herbs again and began to complain. Soon you would all starve. There would be only one way out. The woodcutter would have to lead the children out into the forest in the morning. Maybe the children would have more luck in the forest. The woodcutter looked at the woman in shock and was about to protest when she handed her husband a cup of herbal tea. The bitter taste made him forget his worries. The woman was probably right. Gretel had overheard their conversation. Panic and fear rose in her, and she told her brother what she had heard. But Hansel was not worried. He reassured his sister nothing would happen. He knew his way around the forest well, but Gretel was skeptical and crept out in the darkness as she desperately searched for a solution. She saw a white duck strutting around the house in the moonlight. Its bright plumage shone in the moonlight, and the duck told her to follow it a little way. She led the girl to her mother's grave, on which she also saw a shimmering glow. The moonlight made the stones on the grave glow, and Gretel had an idea. She quickly collected the stones and hid them under her apron. She then crept back into the house and fell asleep next to her brother. The next morning, the father woke the children and told them that he was taking them to the forest today. He was going to cut down some trees there. Hansel packed his things in a good mood and prepared to leave. The stepmother took half a loaf of bread and gave them both a piece of it and said they should divide it well. There might not be any more. Times are hard. As they set off, Gretel looked back at the house with worry. The stepmother snorted at her in annoyance. She should hurry up. Unseen and secretly, Gretel dropped one of the stones every few steps. When they arrived in the middle of the forest, the father told them to gather wood. He would build a fire so that they wouldn't freeze while he looked after the trees. When the fire was burning, the stepmother came to them and told them to lie down by the fire and wait dutifully. No sooner had they sat down than the woman threw a handful of herbs into the fire. The acrid smell got into the children's nostrils, and Gretel noticed that she could no longer keep awake. Both fell into a deep sleep. The sun had already set when Gretel woke up again. The fire had almost gone out. Full of fright, Gretel woke her brother, who was still asleep on the ground. "Wake up, Hansel! It has happened! We are alone in the forest!" Hansel sat up, ponderous and sleepy. When he was finally on his feet, he understood the seriousness of their situation. "Oh dear, how are we supposed to find our way home in the dark?" Gretel looked around anxiously and packed her things. Finally, she pointed to one of the glittering stones, which gave off a blue, almost magical glow in the moonlight. Hansel only looked at her in disbelief, but Gretel took him by the hand, and together they marched off purposefully. The glowing stones formed an unmistakable path through the dark forest, and now Hansel also understood how they could get home. It was a good hour before they reached their father's house. A fire was burning inside. When they opened the door, the stepmother looked at them venomously. "What are you doing home so late?" The father, however, was relieved and embraced them both. Annoyed, the stepmother left the house and looked out into the forest. For a few seconds, she pondered how the children had managed to find their way through the forest. Then she recognized the glittering stones. "Such a clever beast," she murmured, and went back into the house. Again she brewed her husband a herbal tea and rubbed her ointment on his back. With insistence she demanded again, the next day, he should lead the children out into the forest and finish what he had started. Gretel knew that the stepmother would not rest, and once again the girl crept outside and collected the glittering stones. The next morning, the stepmother woke the children early. She urged them to get going, as they had to go much deeper into the forest today. Gretel was just about to pack up her things when the stepmother gruffly told her that she had to carry the firewood to the campsite today. Gretel looked at her frightened and was about to reach for her little bag of stones when she realized it was no longer there. The stepmother must have taken it from her when she was asleep. Wordlessly, the stepmother pressed a thin slice of bread into each of the children's hands and shooed them out of the house with her father. In despair, Gretel told her brother that she had no more stones to mark the way. Hansel reassured his sister and told her not to worry. He had something with which he would mark the path. So this time Hansel stayed behind and looked hopefully towards the house. Hansel trotted leisurely after the others, breaking off a piece of his bread every few steps and letting it fall to the ground. When they finally arrived after a seemingly endless march, Hansel had consumed all the bread. Once again the stepmother stoked the fire and told the children to sit close to the fire. The woman then turned to Gretel and told her that this time it was goodbye forever. And this time she was right. And again, the woman threw the herb into the fire, and the children became so tired that they could no longer keep awake. The cooing of an old owl woke Gretel. This time, the fire was already completely extinguished, and the moon was also hiding behind the clouds. Gretel called for her brother in the darkness. Snorting, Hansel awoke and crawled to his sister. "Don't worry, I did as you did and left us a trail home." Relieved, Gretel hugged her brother. Then she took him by the hand and was about to leave. But when she looked around, she saw no glimmering stones, only the flashing eyes of the old owl. who had begun to pick breadcrumbs from the path. "Hansel, where do we have to go?" Gretel asked worriedly. Hansel looked over at the owl and then turned uncertainly to his sister. "I told him the birds had eaten the breadcrumbs I had spread along the way." Gretel looked at her brother in disbelief. It was cold and dark, and without something to eat, you were not allowed to stay in the forest. The two children moved into the dark forest, and Gretel's heart grew heavier and heavier. When Hansel noticed this, he took his little sister in his arms and began to sing a song. Gretel smiled at him and drew new courage. She was clever and brave, but she envied her brother for never losing his good humor. After what seemed like an eternity, the sun finally rose again in the sky. The two children were hungrily tired and exhausted, but it was hopeless. They had been led too deep into the forest and had lost all orientation. Hansel already wanted to eat some berries in the forest, but Gretel had stopped him. That would be too dangerous. After hours, they came to a small stream. Gretel noticed herbs growing on the bank of the stream. Sadly, she remembered her stepmother and the misfortune that came into the house with her. Then she suddenly heard Hansel calling for her. He seemed completely excited. Gretel finally saw him through a clearing, standing in front of a hut and jumping around. "Gretel, we are saved! And look, the whole house is made of gingerbread." Gretel was taken aback. Really? A house made of gingerbread? In the middle of the forest? She had never heard of such a thing, let alone seen it. But she didn't know much of the world yet either, and the hunger in her belly took away all her worries. Hansel was already nibbling on one of the gingerbreads and jumping enthusiastically in circles. Gretel did the same and broke off a piece from the window. The taste was incredible. She had never eaten anything so delicious and sweet. The two giggled and were in the greatest of joy. Then the door of the house opened creakily, and out of the darkness they heard a creaking voice. "Crunchy, crunchy, crunchy. Who was crunching my little house?" Hansel was about to answer when Gretel beat him to it and called out, the wind, the heavenly child." "Is that so?" spoke the voice, and stepped out of the darkness. It was an old hunched woman leaning on a stick. The children wanted to run away in fright, but were completely frozen. "Well, dear little children, who has brought you so deep into the forest?" This time it was Hansel who spoke up and told the old woman about their misfortune. The old woman put on a worried and caring face and invited them both into her house. Gretel grabbed Hansel by the arm and wanted to stop him, but her brother refused. "We have no place to sleep and nothing to eat." Reluctantly, Gretel gave in, and the two entered the house. It was impressive. From the inside, the house seemed much bigger. Candles flickered in the house. A large kitchen with a set table stood in the middle of the room, and sweets hung on the walls. There also seemed to be 2 other rooms in the house that one would never have guessed from the outside. The old woman led the two to the table and gave them plenty to eat. Slowly, the children's worries disappeared. When they had eaten their fill, the old woman led them to 2 feather-soft beds. The 2 of them had never experienced such luxury. Hansel immediately snuggled into the soft bed and began to sleep deeply. The old woman looked once more at Gretel and began to laugh darkly. Then she threw a handful of herbs into the fire. It seemed as if the fire devoured the herbs with a greedy mouth, and dark smoke spread through the room. And Gretel became quite sleepy. Where did this acrid smell come from? but she could no longer think clearly and fell into a deep sleep. The next day, the old woman woke Gretel rudely with her stick. She was now lying on the cold floor. The soft beds were gone, as were all the other incredible wonders. The room was now barren and gloomy. Gretel could not see Hansel and looked around with worry, but the old woman only laughed and said, "He is outside in the cage, and you will take care of him. Isn't that what you always do?" The old woman giggled nastily, and Gretel rushed outside. Sure enough, Hansel was sitting in a cage, eating a piece of roast meat. Gretel wanted to free him from the cage, but it was useless. The door was locked. Gretel fell to her knees beside Hansel and began to cry. But Hansel turned to her and said, "Don't be sad, we've never had it so good. I've never eaten anything so good. Taste it." "Oh, Hansel, it won't end well. I don't know what to do." Hansel smiled at his sister and said confidently, "But no, you are the smartest person in the world. I'm not worried." A loud knock on the cage jolted Gretel out of her thoughts. The old woman was standing there and snapped at her gruffly. "Come on, there's a lot for you to do. Make the boy eat so that he gets nice and fat, and there's housework waiting for you. Go on." From then on, Gretel had no choice. In the morning, she was forced by the old woman to clean and cook food for Hansel. Even the old woman sat grumbling in front of her stove with a hot fire and grumbled to herself. Sometimes she talked to the flames, and strangest of all, the fire sometimes seemed to answer her too. In the evenings, Gretel had to help the witch weave baskets in which she stored her herbs. Sometimes before going to bed, the old woman would examine her treasures. There were all kinds of things in them, like gold balls, valuable coins, and many other wonders. And the old woman always instructed her to throw new wood on the fire. Under no circumstances should the fire go out. Never. Gretel noticed that the old woman could no longer see well either. With her huge nose, she recognized the herbs, but she could hardly see anything. So she mostly just felt out her riches. In the evening, she went to Hansel and told him to stick his hand out of the cage. When Gretel noticed this, she told Hansel to stick one of the chicken bones out of the cage in the future. As long as the witch believed that Hansel was a skinny fellow, they would have time to find a way out, for surely she would want to eat him when he should be fat and round. From then on, Hansel always held out his bone to her, which the witch greedily palpated. Afterward she cursed and scolded bitterly that this greedy boy did not gain an ounce of weight. So the days passed. Gretel had to slave for the old woman from morning till night, and Hansel was fattened up in the cage outside. One evening, the old woman had once again fallen asleep in her bed, snoring, and Gretel was still scrubbing the floor. She heard a Grimm voice from the stove. "Girl, come here to me." Gretel looked around uncertainly. It was indeed the fire speaking to her. "What do you want from me, flame tongue?" she asked. "I can help you. It's nice and warm here with me, and all your worries are gone when you're with me. I promise." "But then I'll burn." "But no, you silly girl. I'm a magical fire. With me you will become endlessly powerful, just like the old woman. All you have to do for that is give me your hand." "And then can I and my brother leave here?" asked Gretel. "Ah, whatever you want, ha ha ha!" For a moment Gretel hesitated. She was about to step closer to the fire when the flames tried to reach for her. She staggered back and tripped over her cleaning bucket, which shot towards the flames. Cursing and swearing, the flames retreated to the far corner of the stove. Terrified, Gretel closed the hatch to the stove and lay down in the corner of the room, where she pondered, frightened, about a way out. The next day began with more hard work, but this time the old witch came into the kitchen at noon and said that today was the big day. Hansel would be roasted today, whether lean or fat. She wouldn't wait another day. With a horrible laugh, the old witch instructed Gretel to prepare the oven and scrub it well clean. Gretel was full of horror. She had to act now, or it would be all over. So as not to startle the witch, she began to prepare everything as instructed. She hid some of the herbs under her apron and threw some wood scraps to the greedy fire, which it greedily devoured. She began scrubbing around the stove and finally stopped at the hatch. How am I going to clean inside the stove? I can't even get there, can I? And what if the fire accidentally goes out? I haven't even given it any wood yet. The old woman looked over at her sullenly.
Don't be like that, you silly girl.
Show me and I will do as you say, replied Gretel insistently. Reluctantly, the old woman trudged over to her and bent down to the stove with the blazing flames. Here, watch out, you crawl in over there. And have you already stoked the fire, you silly child? Curiously, the old woman stuck her head towards the fire. At that moment, Gretel threw the herbs she was hiding under her apron into the fire. A cloud of black smoke shot towards the witch, and she began to cough terribly. At that moment, Gretel reached for the key that the old woman had always tied around her waist. The old woman tried to fight back and lash out, but Gretel was quicker and pushed the old witch towards the stove. The floor was so wet and slippery that the old woman lost her balance and fell towards the fire. At that moment, the flames grabbed the old woman and pulled her deep into the furnace. Without even a moment's hesitation, Gretel closed the hatch of the stove.
No, let me go, let me out of here.
The witch's screams were terrible. But Gretel did not want to waste any more time. With the key in her hand, she rushed to her brother and freed him. Then they searched the boxes in the witch's house, which were full of treasures and riches. They took as many as they could carry. In the oven, they heard the witch's last scream fall silent. Then they left the witch's house and did not look back. They marched in one direction for a long time, when Gretel spotted a white duck on a river in the forest. There, Hansel, she will lead us home, said Gretel, full of hope. And Hansel followed his clever sister, of whom he was so proud. As the sun set, the duck led them to a path of shining stones. It was the path Gretel had once taken to the house. And relieved, Gretel began to follow the pebbles. And indeed, they reached the woodcutter's house. When they opened the door, the woodcutter could hardly believe it. He was sitting alone at the table, crying for his 2 children. The stepmother had left him shortly after the children had disappeared. Perhaps she had lost her way in the forest herself, or she had sought her fortune elsewhere. It didn't matter to the children. They were glad that they were now alone with their father, and with the children came happiness and prosperity in the woodcutter's house. They were now to lead a happy life. And indeed, everything was soon to change for the fairy tale kingdom.
Follow our YouTube channel and don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. See you soon in the graphic kingdom.